Hey, book lovers, welcome back to 5 Minute Book Reviews. I'm Jerry, your host, and I want to take an opportunity to review Jesus the King by Tim Keller. I read this, it took me a bit to get through it. I'll get to that in a minute, but I'm just about finished with Devotion by Adam Makos, and I'll be reviewing that here hopefully in the next couple days. Um, it did take me a couple months to get through uh, Jesus the King. It may or may not be the kind of book that you sit down and just read straight through. You could probably read this like in a devotional context if you wanted, but um, I part of that is just my problem because I like to read three or four books at a time, and sometimes it takes me a little longer to get through them than I had hoped. And then there's other times where I pick up a book and I start reading it, and then I set it down and pick it up again later. Anyhow, this book by Tim Keller, who happens to be a preacher at the Redeemer Presbyterian Church in Manhattan, New York. This book is just really, really, really good. It's a journey through the Gospel according to Mark. In the book, Keller covers every chapter of Mark's Gospel to some extent or another, every verse. It's not an exposition of every word or verse. It's not a commentary. Um, it is an exploration of the theme expressed in the title, Jesus the King. He wants us, the reader, to see how Jesus is the King and how Mark, kind of sums this up. Mark's Gospel is my favorite of the four Gospels. I love the pace that he writes. I love the way he, weaves his narrative and puts bookends on it. And I love, and even though Keller doesn't address the way Mark ends the book, I love the way Mark ends the book with just the word fear or afraid. And Keller doesn't really get into that. I wish he had, but be that as it may. I love it when books like this happen. And I know this is an older book. Um, I believe it's a book that's based on sermons he preached at some point in his life, at least according to the introduction. It was previously titled King's Cross. 16 chapters of Mark's Gospel are covered in 18 chapters in this book, which should give us an indication that this is not a commentary on Mark's Gospel, but it is, again, an exploration of that theme, Jesus the King. Some other books that I've read recently in recent years, like N.T. Wright's How God Became King, or The Day the Revolution Began, Kingdom Conspiracy by Scott McKnight. Um, these are all great books exploring these themes and this theme of Jesus, the King, the cosmic King, the earthly King, and how he went about, becoming that King, through the resurrection, the ascension, the crucifixion, resurrection, the ascension. Along the way, Keller quotes from important Bible scholars like Richard Bauckham, Martin Luther, important literary figures like Kafka, Homer, even J.K. Rowling makes an appearance in this book. Um, and of course, no Tim Keller sermon or book is going to be complete without numerous references to C.S. Lewis or Jonathan Edwards. He takes time to explain Greek and Hebrew concepts and words. He quotes nearly the entire Gospel of Mark in the text. I didn't look to see if it was the entire text, but I'm fairly certain that he's pretty much got the whole book in there. He even explains difficult passages to understand, like, for example, that passage in the Transfiguration when Peter wants to set up tabernacles. What I like about the book is that it's about Jesus, and Keller never strays away from talking about Jesus. I've listened to a lot of preachers in my 50 years, read a lot of theology, and I find that preachers and teachers and authors always want to bring a sermon or a book back to their pet project or idea. In some churches, you can't go a minute without hearing about baptism or communion or prayer. In some churches, you can't. In some authors, you can't go a minute without hearing about, maybe John Calvin or Charles Darwin. In some teachings, the teacher always finds a way to bring it back to money or relationships or cultural relevance. And Tim Keller's having none of that. That's not to say he doesn't talk about money or Calvin or Darwin or suffering or hate or hurt or cultural relevance. He does all these things and much more besides. But he never fails in every single chapter to bring it back to Jesus. He's always hovering, always circling, never losing his focus. He has one objective, to tell us about Jesus, and he does that very, very well. I spent a lot of time listening to Keller's sermons on podcast, and I've probably listened to more of his sermons than I've read of his books, truth be told. I think he's a much better preacher than I think he is an author, but that's a subjective thing, and that should really in no way deter you from reading this book. Tim Keller, whether writing or preaching, he makes me want to dig deeper. He makes me want to take chances with my faith. He makes me want to know more about Jesus and walk with Jesus more closely. He makes me choose between faith and Jesus and the science of the self. He always does these things with reference to Jesus. You can't read a page in this book where Jesus is not mentioned. And I want my own life to be that way. What it means is that when Tim Keller is writing or preaching or teaching or living or talking or walking or eating, he's thinking about Jesus. That's how I want my life to be also. Jesus in the front, behind, above, below, inside, outside, all around, engaging my every thought, energizing my every move, the catalyst, sustainer, and end of everything that I say and do. And that's what Tim Keller's writing and his preaching do for me on a continual basis. He's Jesus is the subject and the object of my worship. And this is probably what it means when we say, that we love God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. Kind of how Jesus is kind of always consumed with his thoughts about us. I so want to be consumed with my thoughts about him. I read this book. 5 stars out of 5 stars. You won't regret it. Hey, come back next time. Hit the subscribe button. Click the link. Go to my Goodreads. Go to my blog. Visit. Next time we're going to be reviewing, again, this book by Adam Makos called Devotion. A great book on the Korean War and some friendships, perhaps unlikely friendships that developed during those times. Thanks again. Peace and grace. I'll talk to you soon.